Hi, and this episode of Retvlog is going to be, in a very real sense, an actual vlog. I'm going to discuss a few things. There's no main theme, although I think the thing I'm going to mostly talk about is Rets in the raid, Uldir, particularly Mythic, well, actually exclusively Mythic. But yeah, it's going to be a mix of things in there, so I'm just going to play down. If you're looking for any great wisdom, it's probably not going to be in this one. So first things first, what you can sort of see behind me is us doing the, Waycrest Manor on an 8+. We did do a 10+. I've actually done a 10+ in my new casual mode where I'm basically playing World of Warcraft like twice a week. And each session is not necessarily even as long as I used to do each day before when I was a Mythic Raider myself. So it's taken us a while with our next to no gear. But one thing I learned when I did the Infest, I'm not going to show you our +10 because it was actually quite bad. Mistakes were made. Mistakes were repeated. Lessons were generally not learned. But one thing I definitely did learn is that next week, I am taking repentance. The only way we had to deal with the infested mobs was the demon hunters in prison, and it didn't always work very well. Many deaths as a result. So I am taking repentance next week. It's on my bar. Well, it's not actually. I need to click it on. I'm going to go on after I've done this and click that on. So, But one thing that I noticed, like people were saying, "Oh, Waycrest Manor is going to be really tough with the affixes we got this week," and we actually did that. You know, okay, it was a +8, but for our level, I mean, blimey, that was it. And we two-chested that, and I think it sort of showed as well where part of our problems are that we're not brilliantly geared. Certainly not geared as well as even heroic raiders at the moment. But at the same time, it also just shows you, if you're used to a dungeon, how much easier it is. Like Tol de Gore, which is what we did on the +10, we've done like once before on a very low. In fact, have we even done that on Mythic Plus? I don't think we've even done that on Mythic Plus. I think as a group, as our social group, we did it on just normal Mythic. But yeah, but Waycrest Manor, we did also, like last weekend, we were doing loads of them. We kept getting Waycrest Manor keys. So we're going over and over and over again with that. So when it came to doing a +8 for that, it was like, yeah, no problem at all. But anyway, next thing I want to sort of talk about really is something that came as a result of the AMA. Now, you might think to yourself, AMA, I don't really remember anything about Rets coming up there. Sort of it didn't. If you've been watching my tweets, you may have seen what this is going to be about. Ian has a cost. I can't even remember what he was talking about or which class he was talking about. I forget. It might have been Windwalker Monks, but I can't remember. But this response came up. It says, no, we don't think that's healthy. Forget about what the healthy thing is. It's the next bit. It's a similar situation to the gameplay AMS used to yield for Death Knights. Defensives with a backlash component are an interesting space to explore, but when your defensive gameplay turns into actively seeking out sources of damage, that's pretty degenerate. Now, what does this sound like, of course, for us? Shield of Vengeance. I've been describing it as degenerate gameplay for quite a while. There were a number of things that we had with the Legion toolkit that I would describe as degenerate. Shield of Vengeance was definitely one of them. Holy Wrath was another. Holy Wrath went by the by because not only would it require degenerate play to use it, but it was not actually going to be strong anyway, so people just left it out. Whereas Shield of Vengeance not only is a core ability, so you get some damage out of it, so of course you're going to use it for that, but it's one of the few defenses we have. It basically, effectively, you can think, replace Divine Protection. I would much rather have Divine Protection as a defensive. But that's what we use it for. Whenever, in any guides, myself, my own included, although I will say, okay, if you have a defensive use for it, defensive takes precedence, because you can't do DPS dead, the bottom line is most of the time it's not actually a great defensive. It's on a fairly long cooldown for what it is. It's a damage ability, and it's treated as a damage ability. So, within has a cost to saying, when your defensive gameplay turns into actively seeking out sources of damage, which of course is what we do, because although it's lovely if we get a load of damage that will just automatically blow it, because then we can argue, well, we've also reduced the damage we've taken, being kind to the healers. The fact of the matter is, if you mostly consume it, or even a little bit consume it, and you see the timer ticking down, you're thinking, oh, it's not all consumed, you will stand in a pool of fire to make sure it blows. Even if, quite frankly, it means taking a little tick of extra damage. That's what happens. That's what we do. That's the min-maxy attitude to it. Not necessarily saying everyone does that, but if you need to min-max, well, that can help you min-max. Who wants a 0.1% wipe and then think to themselves, I never actually used Shield of Vengeance on that fight at any point. So I sent a tweet there going, oh, very interested to see these comments. Thank you very much. So when are we going to get some changes to Shield of Vengeance? Didn't get a response to that, unsurprisingly. So anyway, on to looking at the participation in Mythic. Now, raid testing Uldir and the PTR, which is the only time I've really been in Uldir. My issue has always been, without trying to get too many, the issue has always been, I think, for Rets, but for a lot of melee in general as well. There are very, very few fights. There are occasionally some, but they're very rare, and I mean rare, not unusual, that really favour having more melee than ranged. But they are really rare. You're talking like Gul'dan in Nighthold, where in actual fact having a healthy crop of melee is really good. Most fights, it doesn't matter that much, but if you have the choice, you'd probably still take a slightly greater balance of ranged. And then there are quite a lot of fights, and these are not rare at all. In fact, these are common, where you want a balance of range. And for some fights, which are not necessarily common, but they're not rare either, if you don't have a lot of range, you are actively slowing your progress down on certain fights as well. And there can be several reasons for this. One could be lots of target swapping. So melee have to physically then move between them, whereas a range can just go, oh, if they're in range of both targets, they can just switch from one to the other. One can be if there's lots of splash damage effects. Obviously, that means melee have to be able to spread out. So that limits the number of melee you can have in terms of being able to spread out around the boss, still hit it without splashing onto each other. Whereas range can spread out much more easily. One can be where you're going to have a very deadly ground effect around the boss, which means you have to move out before you can move back in. And then, of course, you're doing limited, if any, damage. Whereas range already out of it. I mean, you get that impression as soon as you go into Uldir. The very first trash, which is just basically two tentacles, you know, the same thing, isn't it? You go onto one, and then all of a sudden it turns into a melee-hating puddle on the ground, then you have to go to the other and so on. Whereas range just stand back going, oh, I'll shoot that one. I might shoot that one. No, I'll shoot this one. I don't care. I'll shoot both. So, if you're a warlock. So, yeah, it's... There are a number in there. And you might look at it dispassionately and say, well, there's maybe a couple of fights that aren't great for melee. That's all right, isn't it? And I think the issue always is, well, it might be, but the problem is, not only on those fights you potentially bench, because they might take a few melee, but they're not going to take loads. And again, it depends on the nature of it, as to which melee are going to suffer the least on it, or in other words, be able to do the most damage. But the thing is, if you're a guild planning for your roster, you're planning to have a roster that's going to be strong on every fight. And the bigger the core roster you can have, and when I say a core roster, I mean the people who are going to be basically there on every single fight, the better, because then they're used to playing with each other, they form a more effective team. They'll look at it and think to themselves, well, if there's a couple of fights where we want to have loads of, several warlocks, things like that, those are ranged, then in actual fact we're better off just having a roster full of ranged. Are there any fights where we actually want a load of melee? No. So we'll just try and get a load of ranged. But anyway, so when you look at the Warcraft logs and you see sort of where we are in terms of damage, and a lot of people, first of all, people have come into it and chosen their classes, often on the basis of sim DPS, which is an absolute nonsense, because those are just based on patchwork fights. Raid fights are not patchwork fights. When you're talking about damage, and although I talk about utility as being of prime importance, if you have a piece of utility that will allow you to trivialize a mechanic on a boss, you have got a raid spot. That is essentially, unless you're absolutely useless, that is essentially it. But beyond that, and often most people don't bring any specific utility for a particular fight, So then, you know, as a DPS, your job is essentially to DPS the boss. So DPS is still ultra important. It's just that, you know, from a Mythic Raider point of view, as a Mythic Raider, you are expected to be able to maximize your DPS anyway. That's not where your use comes in. But the actual logs tend to tell a better picture because they're how much damage you're actually doing on a particular fight. And if we look at the overall, and of course overall is you know, it's just where you will first go. You can look at it first of all and go, oh well, typical middle of the pack. But what I always say is you can't just look at that because that just gives every DPS spec. Well, that's no use because you need to think of it in terms of class role combinations. You know, for example, if, as the case is, there's a mage spec above us, which there is, although only very slightly, it has to be said. If it doesn't matter that there are 2 mage specs below us, we're not better than a mage because they will play the spec that's best for a given fight. And of course, that's the overall as well. It may be that on some fights one spec is better, on some fights another. So when you actually work out the average being done by mages, it may well be significantly better. But you know, that's, I've not looked into that. I'm not, just as an example. So when you actually look at it, I had a little look at this. So below us, in terms of actual class role combinations, there's Feral Druids, Enhancement Shamans, Shadow Priests, Elemental Shaman, and Balanced Druids. So not looking great for Shaman and Druids. But bear in mind, both of those classes have had tuning buffs. Not necessarily enough, and not necessarily for all those specs. But it does nonetheless mean that, because this data is based on the last 2 weeks, so if one reset they didn't have those tuning buffs, and this reset they do, in actual, the reality might be a little bit higher. It's still not, I don't think it's still solved yet. I think some of the problems, particularly with like Feral Druids, I'm not sure about Enhancement Shamans, but it could be the case with those as well. And certainly Shadow Priests, is that I don't think it's even just a case of tuning numbers up. I think it's just something fundamentally with the way the whole thing works, the whole kit works. You know, it's much the same with our AoE, but everything else seems to work okay for us at least. And of course, we haven't had any tuning done, so, you know. Now, in terms of participation, because participation at this stage, I think, is really telling. Because we're into the second reset. This doesn't include the second lot of weekend raids, of course, because I'm doing this on a Saturday lunchtime-ish. But the participation is more telling than just looking at how much damage you can do in a particular fight, because the guilds that are killing mythic bosses right now are the guilds who are organised and know what they're doing and have planned ahead and have tried at least. And the ones who've killed more mythic bosses tend to be the ones who got themselves a stronger roster as well as their organisation. But the problem is, of course, you could look at it and say, well, there's not great numbers at the moment. So it's one of these trade-offs. It's really tricky from a statistical point of view. So at the moment, there are not massive numbers, particularly the further in you go. Once you get to Zul, forget about it. There's too few numbers then. But up to Zul, there's enough numbers for you to be able to tell something, but you have to be a bit careful. And someone could easily say, well, it's not a large enough sample size. The problem is, if we wait until there is a large enough sample size, then you have a situation where the classes that are actually, the class role combinations that are actually weak in that raid are artificially inflated in terms of participation, because now what's happened is that the numbers are larger because the guilds who might well be perfectly good and got perfectly skillful players, they've now killed bosses, but it took them longer because they didn't have the ideal classes. So, you know, they're the ones who've got more of those weaker ones, but they've pushed through it because of the extra gear that's helped them push through, and maybe some tuning nerfs and buffs here and there. So it is a difficult balance to take. So, but where we see it is, in terms of participation with Ret Paladins overall, it's not awful. There's about 9 specs with higher participation than us. Several of those have much higher participation, as you might expect, which is not terrible. I mean, that's not awful. Where it massively drops off is certainly Fetid Devourer. Fetid Devourer, it's quite a nice fight. I quite like it, but, you know, the movement is just death. You know, there's so much movement, and particularly on Mythic, especially on Mythic. So it's infrequent enough on Heroic. On Mythic, maybe less so. In fact, quite frankly, the best thing you can do with the Ret, I suspect, on Mythic, not having done it myself, this is where I have to err on the side of caution here, but probably it's one of those fights where the best thing you can do with the Ret is leave him on the bloody boss, will you? You know, but because our single target's actually quite good. I mean, that's probably the best thing to do. But what it means is more likely you're just not going to take one, you're going to take something else. And that is indeed what's happened. If you just look at it, yeah, the relative proportion of participation on that compared to especially the first two bosses, but even other bosses, is way lower. And the problem is when you have a class, and I'm not saying this is a Ret specific problem, this is a melee specific or melee problem in general. But some melee are hit harder than others. We're not the worst hits by any means. But when you have this situation, you've got the twin problems, one of which I've already alluded to. When your guild is planning out who your core roster is going to be, they're looking at all the fights and it's thinking, well, okay, we could take you for the first two bosses, but we know we're not going to take you for Fetid Devourer, which may actually, for Mythic, be the fourth boss in reality. We know we're not going to take you for that. So why would we take you for the others? Because you might get some gear that could go to someone we want for that. Because especially with this personal loot thing, you know, when it was master loot, it might not have been such an issue. But for personal loot, you might actually now get gear that you can't trade that is effectively useless for when they get to Fetid Devourer because it's sat on a bench, not in the raid. So you take the players, even on the easier bosses, that you need for the next bosses in your progress run, because you want the players you want people to get gear. And then, of course, you know, because you're not getting it, even when it's on farm the second week, you're not getting in. Your gear's falling behind. I mean, if you want for Mythic Plus, you'd be completely buggered. But your gear is still going to fall behind. So then when you get to a later boss where actually you're okay for it, well, your gear's behind. And this is the big problem when Blizzard really don't. And I had some hope when Ian Hazacosta said they were going to get, because we know there's no coordination between teams, but they said there's going to be coordination between the encounter design team and the class design team. Well, that is clearly nonsense, because otherwise you wouldn't allow this situation to happen. Do you know what? Now that I'm thinking, I should have just done this as a general video, not a Ret video, but because it affects several others. But anyway, so, I mean, that's the situation as it looks there. In terms of other things with us, AoE is still an issue that has still not been tackled. I mean, I don't want to blow it out of proportion. For the majority of people, I'm guessing it's not a problem. It's not a problem for me, personally. Like, when I was doing the Mythic Plus dungeons last night, remember, I'm in a group of people much like myself, we're just basically casuals. We did actually take one person who's not a casual last night, actually. He replaced our healer who was off doing other things. The point is that although no one in that group has a lower item level than me, I think one DPS has the same, one a little bit higher, not loads higher, a little bit higher. Overall, when you look at the overall damage done after each dungeon that we did, and that included the plus 10, my damage was highest. But it could also be argued that part of the reason for that is because we're so awful, there were quite a lot of deaths. I'm probably going to be one of, not always, but I'm probably going to be one of the last people to die. Therefore, I get the benefit of the retribution proc quite a bit. So part of it could be padding from that. Because certainly on individual packs, sometimes on packs I hold my own on AoE packs. That's usually when I've got wings available. Which, of course, when it's teaming, fortified and quaking, yeah, I use wings as much as I can on trash. If I haven't got it for the start of a boss fight, I don't give a shit. I am using it on trash. So I was doing the most overall, but on individual packs, especially when I didn't have wings, on some packs I fell well behind. I just fell well behind. It was like pathetic, the damage I was doing. And on other ones it was sort of okay. So it's hugely inconsistent. I mean, part of that is probably because, of course, I'm taking Blade of Wrath and Divine Purpose, which are both obviously proc-based talents, both of which, you know, can be used for AoE purposes. You know, Blade of Wrath resetting more often means more holy power. Divine Purpose means free spenders. So that's more, when it's kind to me, more Divine Storms. When it's not so kind, I'm not getting those Divine Storms. And that can essentially be the difference. I mean, my choice to play those ones, even though they do sim better for me as well in those situations, in that hectic Adcleave situation. So, But yeah, the AoE, I think everyone agrees, does need some work. Not on a tuning point of view, but just on changing something. Whether it be changing the Divine Judgment talent somehow, because at the moment that wouldn't even boost your DPS. For AoE, that is. It boosts your thing. You know, it's useful on a boss with some ads, but beyond that, it's not that useful. Or a priority ad, shall we say, as well as other ads around it. But I think something fundamentally needs to be done to improve that. And, you know, I mean, the obvious one, and what I keep sort of saying is, you know, if Judgment were a buff, then that would help a lot. Because the problem is, at the moment, you put Judgment on something. I know it's not there all the time, it's consumed now, but you put Judgment on something, use a Divine Storm, the extra damage is only done on that primary target, the rest of it's just normal. Whereas if it was more like a buff, even if it were consumed when you use a spender still, then that would help. But what would be better is if it weren't, if it just actually just gave you a buff. And I know the issue could be, well, Judgment, you know, it's very debuffy and it's always sort of been that sort of debuff type thing. But gameplay over anything else like that, you know, I would say. But anyway, I think it's mostly what I want to talk about there. I just think, I mean, if you're doing Mythic Uldir as a Ret Paladin, let me know how it's going for you. I just think it's not a great one. And I was worried about it when I was thinking that I would be doing it on Mythic. I was a little concerned myself. It didn't form part of my decision making because, you know, as people who've been watching this for a while will know, I am playing casually now. It's not because I thought, oh, do you know, it's going to be a bad one. It's just because I don't have time. I mean, put it this way. I'm playing World of Warcraft twice a week for a few hours, literally. 3 hours one session. Well, yeah, probably a total of 6 or 7 hours a week. That's me now. 6 or 7 hours a week. That's it. And this is at the start of expansion, for goodness sake. And yet, I still don't have a lot of time to chill, because the reason why I had to do this is because work has been so insane, and I knew it was going to be insane. So that's why I had to make that decision. But it would be interesting to know what other people are finding out about it, because it just looks to me, and even if it's not like every boss, it only has to be 1 or 2 bosses where you are not really required on that rate. It's like we'll take a Ret or an Enhancement Shaman or a Feral Druid, but this is about Rets, if we have nothing else. But otherwise, it's a bit of a drag. We're causing ourselves problems. You only need 1 or 2 fights like that, and especially with the Force personal loot, it just creates a massive problem. And for such a popular class, I mean, that's the thing. You know, the Ret Paladins are a massively massively popular spec. So it is disappointing. It is disappointing. But anyway, I'll leave you there. I'll just be rambling if I try and talk any more on this one. But let me know in the comments below, please, how you've been getting on in there. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share for further content. Until next time, I'll see you later.